A Wilderness of Error, The Trials of Jeffrey MacDonald, by Errol Morris. Narrated by John Pruden. Copyright 2012 by Errol Morris. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Errol Morris and the Wiley Agency, and was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. I would wish them to seek out for me, in the details I am about to give, some little oasis of fatality amid a wilderness of error. Edgar Allan Poe, William Wilson. Prologue. 544 Castle Drive. I first saw 544 Castle Drive on a cold Christmas morning in 1991. My wife, son, and I had flown from Boston to Raleigh-Durham to join my mother-in-law and Aunt Elizabeth, her older sister, in St. Paul's, North Carolina, a small town about 20 miles south of Fayetteville. There were hardly any grandchildren. Our son Hamilton, who was 4 years old, was the adored new addition to the family. I can't remember whether it was the year of the train set or the year of the tricycle, but it was a perfect day. Often on Christmas we would pick pecans at a nearby farm. You open them by holding 2 pecans in your hand so you can crack one against the other. It was a wonderful small town world. The red brick house with the glassed-in porch and rockers, the breakfast room that looked out on the garden, the green-spode china, the ribbons in the living room from unwrapped presents. We were a young and loving family. My wife and I decided on a small excursion before Christmas dinner. She had wanted to get out of the house. The destination was more or less my idea. A short drive north on the old U.S. highway past Hope Mills, where my mother-in-law and aunt had been born, to Fayetteville, past a pygmy replica of the Eiffel Tower at the Bordeaux Shopping Center, and then on to Fort Bragg. In those days, Fort Bragg was an open base, easily accessible. It wasn't hard to get around, and after consulting various road maps, we found it. There we were, standing in the cold, looking at the attached home where Jeffrey MacDonald, a physician and Green Beret, had lived with his family until February 17, 1970. Early that morning, MacDonald's wife, Colette, and his 2 daughters, Kimberly, aged 5, and Kristen, aged 2, were brutally murdered there. The MacDonald case has produced vast quantities of material. Some of this can be found on websites exclusively devoted to the case. Some is in various law offices around the country, those of a dozen or so defense and appellate attorneys who have represented MacDonald over the years. Somewhere in this material, I found a photograph of Jeffrey MacDonald, Colette, and Kimberly. I'm not sure when it was taken. It might have been before Kristen was born. It was Christmas. On the left, a tree covered in tinsel and surrounded by presents. On the right, a fireplace and mantel covered with decorations. Jeffrey is peeking into the picture, just at the edge of frame, as if he's trying to decide which present to open next. Kimberly, in a party dress with a white collar, is being handed a big blonde doll by her mother. She looks thrilled. It's a universal picture. I had seen photographs of the house the day after the story of the murders broke, the house in subsequent years, the windows covered by plywood. The house had been kept sealed from 1970 until 1984 in the event that it and its contents might be needed as evidence. But on the night of June 7, 1984, the contents were burned and then buried at the Fort Bragg landfill. The government made a list of the property that had been destroyed: refrigerator, stove, broiler pan, occasional dining room table with 4 chairs, government knee-hole desk, dresser, army chair, push lawnmower, yard rake, sprinkler, everything that wasn't already locked up in a lab was incinerated, including the ceilings, interior walls, doors, windowsills, ledges, hardwood floors. Was some piece of evidence that could have unraveled the entire mystery lost in that bonfire? Could the house itself be interrogated? Could it have been forced to give up an answer? I have asked myself many times since that Christmas day, why didn't I plunge into the case then? It was shortly after I had finished The Thin Blue Line, the film based on my investigation of the Randall Dale Adams case, an investigation that had freed an innocent man from prison and had gotten a confession from the killer. I had struggled with that story for 4 years, only to be sued by the man I got out of prison. I told myself I didn't want to become involved in another miscarriage of justice story. They're difficult, perhaps too difficult. I didn't want to go through the agony, the risk, a second time. And yet this was a different kind of miscarriage of justice, different from what we normally envision as a miscarriage of justice. The MacDonald story does have familiar themes: suppressed evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, bumbling investigators, forensic mix-ups, and so on. But there are new and different themes as well, many involving the media. Books, late-night talk shows, and a TV miniseries. There is something disturbing about the MacDonald case, something that has made me return to it again and again over the years. It wasn't the brutality of the murders. I've interviewed my share of mass murderers, including Ed Gein and Edmund Kemper. I was afraid of something even more chilling, that MacDonald was innocent, that he had been made to witness the savage deaths of his family and then was wrongfully convicted for their murders. I wondered if people needed him to be guilty because the alternative was too horrible to contemplate. It has been so long since I first became interested. I recently looked at my notes on what I had imagined doing with it, beginning in 1991. I am a filmmaker, so I first imagined it as a movie. I went to a variety of studio meetings, but the movie I wanted to make was non-standard. The pitch. There are two opposed theories of what happened at 544 Castle Drive on the morning of February 17, 1970. Neither had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet most Americans had only ever been presented with half a story, the half that held that MacDonald was definitely the killer, the half that was the basis for Joe McGinniss's Fatal Vision, a best-selling book that was adapted into a TV miniseries. So let me describe the movie that I imagined. I wanted to cast Gary Cole, who played MacDonald in the TV miniseries, and to use him for my own reenactments of the case. I would juxtapose these reenactments with scenes from the original TV movie. It would be a version of Rashomon, the film by Akira Kurosawa, with competing narrators and different points of view. Here, it would be by the same actor. Such a movie, I thought, could open the case back up and show how critical evidence was ignored or suppressed, how the evidence that was introduced does not confirm MacDonald's guilt. It could help people think and decide for themselves. I stopped. The studio executive across the table clearly wanted to say no. She paused for a moment and said, "We can't make that." I asked why. "Because he's guilty," she said. "The man killed his family." And I said, "But he might be innocent." And she said, "No, he killed his family." It became a recurring theme. People thought they knew the story, but it was because they had read the book, or had seen the TV miniseries, or both. And the important question was lost under the heap. Had anyone proved that Jeffrey MacDonald was guilty of the murder of his family? Millions of words have been spoken, written, read, affidavits, court transcripts, lab reports, videotaped interviews, newspaper articles, and now even blogs. But what do they really tell us? Book 1. Chapter 1. A Convincing Story. If God were suddenly condemned to live the life he has inflicted on men, he would kill himself. Alexander Dumas, Pensée d'Album. It's a 19th century image. An island fortress, forbidding, dark, isolated, surrounded on all sides by cliffs and the sea. In Alexander Dumas' 1844 novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, that fortress is the Chateau d'If. Dantes, who will become the Count of Monte Cristo, has been taken prisoner. In a rowboat, he is pleading with his captors. He demands to know where he is being taken. "Unless you are blind or have never been outside the harbor, you must know." "I do not." "Look round you then." Dantes rose and looked forward. When he saw rise within 100 yards of him the black and frowning rock on which stands the Chateau d'If. This gloomy fortress, which has for more than 300 years furnished food for so many wild legends, seemed to Dantes like a scaffold to a man condemned to death. "The Chateau d'If," he cried. "What are we going there for?" The gendarme smiled. "Surely I am not going there to be imprisoned," said Dantes. "It is a prison for high crimes of state, and is used only for political prisoners. I have committed no crime." Dantes, a fictional character, has been framed for a crime he did not commit. He has been convicted and condemned by Dumas, his creator, to a prison from which there is no possibility of escape. And yet Dantes does escape, under an improbable set of circumstances that have been told and retold, and that have inspired countless other stories. Dumas's tale is a variant of the theme "Never Say Never." There is no fortress, no prison from which there is no escape. We marvel at Dantes's daring, the fake burial at sea, the swim to a nearby island, the construction of a new, fabulous identity. But we know that he has escaped only because Dumas wants it so. There can be no denying his innocence, just as there can be no thwarting his inexorable climb to a position of wealth, power, and influence. Dumas has written it that way. In a fictional narrative, all of the pieces can be engineered to fit perfectly together. But reality is different. We have to discover what it is out there, what is real and what is merely a product of our imagination. A real Dantes could turn out to be a schemer, a rat, a traitor. There is in principle no limit to what we might find out about him, to what we might uncover. A real Dantes, like all real characters, is bottomless. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, captured this in his Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, written while he was in prison as a conscientious objector to World War I. Prisoners often have the time to reflect on the difference between artificially constructed stories and reality. When you have taken account of all the feelings roused by Napoleon in writers and readers of history, you have not touched the actual man. But in the case of Hamlet, you have come to the end of him. If no one thought about Hamlet, there would be nothing left of him. If no one had thought about Napoleon, he would have soon seen to it that someone did. It's now the 21st century, and we have a model of a prison that makes the Chateau d'If pale in comparison. Not an imagined prison of stone and steel, but a real prison built out of newsprint and media, a prison of beliefs. You can escape from prison, but how do you escape from a convincing story? After enough repetitions, the facts come to serve the story and not the other way around. Like kudzu, suddenly the story is everywhere and impenetrable. Take the case of Jeffrey MacDonald. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the story was endlessly retold in the media. It was enshrined in a best-selling book, Fatal Vision by Joe McGinniss, in TV journalism, 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace, and ultimately in an incredibly popular TV miniseries with the same title as the book, starring Carl Malden, Gary Cole, and Eva Marie Saint. The 60 Minutes segment on September 18, 1983, was the season premiere of the show. It was watched by 30 million people. The book appeared a couple of months later, and in the following years sold 5 million copies. The 2-part miniseries on NBC was the most popular miniseries of the year. Eventually, the media frenzy ran its course, and the public was sated with the version of events it had been fed. The case was cracked, punishment was administered, justice had been done, and Jeffrey MacDonald was condemned to the story that had been created around him. The MacDonald case was once well known, but is quickly lapsing into obscurity. MacDonald was on the fast track, Princeton for 3 years, medical school at Northwestern, a Green Beret captain at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. He had been accepted for a residency in orthopedics at Yale to follow his service in the military. He was young, handsome, and married to his childhood sweetheart, Colette Stevenson. They had 2 young daughters, Kimberly, aged 5, and Kristen, aged 2. They dreamed of owning a farm in Connecticut. They had a bright and promising future. That ended early on the morning of February 17, 1970. The MPs who had responded to a call for help had found Colette, who was 4 months pregnant with a son, lying on the floor of the master bedroom. She had been brutally beaten and stabbed. Both her arms had been broken, her skull had been fractured, and there were numerous knife stabs in her chest and neck, as well as 24 of what appeared to be ice pick stabs to her chest and arm. Kimberly and Kristen had been found dead in their beds. Kimberly had been stabbed, and the right side of her head had been crushed in with a club. Kristen had been stabbed, but there were no fractures. There was blood everywhere. MacDonald told Ken Micah, one of the first MPs at the scene, "Check my kids. I can't breathe." Micah began to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. MacDonald was lapsing in and out of consciousness, but he described to Micah how he had been sleeping on the couch in the living room, then was awakened by screams. He saw people at the foot of the couch. Micah asked whom he had seen, and MacDonald described the assailants. There were 4 of them. 1 blonde Caucasian female. She had a floppy hat on. 2 male Caucasians and 1 male Negro. Why did they do this? Micah told Lieutenant Joseph Polk, one of his superiors, that he had seen a woman matching the description on his way to the MacDonald home, but no effort was made to pick her up. Within minutes, MacDonald was loaded into an ambulance and taken to Womack Army Hospital, where he was treated for multiple bruises, an abrasion, small punctures, 2 stab wounds, 1 in his stomach and 1 in his chest, and a collapsed lung, a serious injury, but not a mortal one. Specialist 4th Class William Ivory was the investigator on duty for the Fort Bragg office of the CID, the Criminal Investigation Division of the Army. He arrived about 15 minutes after the first MPs and took detailed notes on what he saw. A woman, apparently dead, is lying on her back next to a green armchair. The upper portion of her body was extremely bloody. She was clad in what looks like pink pajama pants. Across her abdomen, a towel or bath mat is laying. Across her chest was some blue cloth with a part of it trailing across the floor to her left side. This was later identified as the blue pajama top. Ivory observed that Colette MacDonald had multiple head injuries and stab wounds in her chest and throat, and a large pool of blood was found under her head and shoulders. Nearby there was a pajama pocket, apparently torn from the pajama top, and then he found what appeared to be a murder weapon. Between the green armchair and the dresser on the north wall there is observed a small wooden-handled knife. A close inspection revealed a bloodstain near the point of the blade. Ivory went on to note that the living room was relatively tidy. The furnishings on the west side of the living room did not appear to have been disturbed. A coffee table in the east side of the living room in front of a brown divan was tipped on its edge, and under the edge there were numerous magazines, the titles of which were not noted at the time. There is a plant with the roots in dirt a few feet east of the overturned table, and a white plant pot sitting upright just north of the edge of the table. About a half hour later, Robert Shaw, another CID investigator, arrived. His case file continues the story of the investigation. 3 weapons were discovered just outside the back door of the house. At 0642 hours, a search of the outside of the quarters was conducted by this investigator. Found, located near the northeast entrance to the quarters, a wooden club which appeared to bear bloodstains and a paring knife with a brown handle and an ice pick with a tan wood handle. The location of these items was sketched and the weapons were collected as evidence. The decision was made to collect this evidence because the photographer on the scene had run out of film or bulbs or had some other tech problem, and there would be an appreciable delay before he could take a picture. Ivory, a young and relatively inexperienced agent, quickly came to the conclusion that there was something wrong with the crime scene. There were signs of a struggle, but perhaps not enough to suggest the presence of 4 intruders. It wasn't long before Ivory and Shaw devised their own theory of the crime. Narratives are ubiquitous. They are part of the way people see the world, part of the way people think. All of us, myself included. Without them, we would be overwhelmed with undigested raw facts. But that doesn't mean that all narratives are created equal. There is fiction, and there is non-fiction. And one of the differences between fiction and fact is that a fictional character is controlled by its creator. It has no reality off the page. There is no physical evidence that can prove that Edmond Dantes is guilty or innocent of a crime. Only what the writer, the author, ultimately decides. But what happens when the narrative of a real-life crime overwhelms the evidence? When evidence is rejected, suppressed, misinterpreted, or is left uncollected at the crime scene, simply because it does not support the chosen narrative. It is easy to confuse a search for revealing plot details with a search for evidence, but there is a difference. In one case, we are wandering through a landscape of words. In the other, we are in the physical world. By all accounts, the crime scene was horrific. 3 bloody and battered bodies. But one detail stood out. On the headboard in the master bedroom, the word pig was written in blood, recalling, perhaps reenacting, the Manson family murders committed only months before. In a real sense, the story of the MacDonald murders begins in the summer of 1969 with Charles Manson and his drug-crazed followers. Chapter 2. Lee Marvin is afraid. On August 9, 1969, Sharon Tate, the wife of Roman Polanski and 8.5 months pregnant, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, and Abigail Folger were shot and stabbed to death in Polanski's Los Angeles home. Polanski was in Europe, otherwise he might have been a suspect in the case. The murders of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca followed the next day. At 10050 Cielo Drive, the Polanski home, the word pig was written on the wall, as it later turned out, in Sharon Tate's blood. At the LaBianca home, 2 phrases, death to pigs and helter-skelter. At first, police believed the Tate and LaBianca murders were unrelated. They also were convinced that the murders were connected with a drug transaction gone awry. When evidence began to accumulate, the idea of hippie killers was explicitly rejected. One police sergeant simply said, "We know what's behind these murders. They're part of a big dope transaction." Similarly, Army investigators rejected the idea that hippie killers had broken into the house at 544 Castle Drive, had killed MacDonald's family, and had written pig on the headboard of the bed. On February 17th, the day of the murders, the headline in the Fayetteville Observer took the form of a question. Victims of hippie cult, officer's wife, children found slain at Fort Bragg. Apparently, there was already skepticism about MacDonald's account of what had happened the previous night. The victims were identified as MacDonald's wife, Colette, 26, and the couple's two daughters, Kimberly, 5, and Kristen Jean, 2. Military authorities said MacDonald told them 4 people, 3 men and a woman, burst through the rear door of the home at approximately 4 a.m. chanting, "LSD is great, LSD is great," while the family slept. One of the suspects, a blonde woman wearing a floppy hat and muddy white boots, was carrying a candle, according to a report from the investigating officers. Officers said another suspect was a Negro man wearing a jacket with sergeant stripes on the sleeves. The 2 other suspects were reportedly white men, they said. Just 3 days later, another question was raised about MacDonald's account of what happened. A February 20th article in the New York Times reported that MacDonald had made a comment to a friend, Lieutenant Ronald Harrison, who was reading an Esquire magazine article about the Manson murders. Isn't that wild? The cover of the March 1970 issue of Esquire was "Evil Lurks in California. Lee Marvin is Afraid." Amid the ads for Pierre Cardin slacks and Canoe aftershave, there was page after page of various kinds of malefaction. An acid goddess who copulates with the swan, a chair that spouts blood, black masses, drugs and more drugs, and of course, Manson and his family. From Harrison's various comments to Army investigators that were released to the press, it might be imagined that MacDonald was interested in some form of Satanism or ritual abuse. Isn't that wild? But a signed statement from Harrison dated July 13, 1970, paints a more ambiguous picture. Although various prosecutors eventually portrayed MacDonald's comment in a sinister light, Harrison was describing a happy home environment, the Brady Bunch with a little witchcraft thrown in. Since I was quoted in the newspapers as saying Jeff and I discussed the Sharon Tate murder case, I feel that I should explain the conversation in its entirety. On Saturday, the 14th of February, I stopped by Jeff's about 7:30 or 8 in the evening. Working clockwise, Colette was seated on the couch, Jeff in his chair, I in mine, Kim on the floor with her PJs on, watching TV from a bear-shaped sleeping bag. We were watching TV and discussing the programs, and I was playing with Kim on the floor. I noticed an Esquire magazine among others on the coffee table. On the cover it said, "Evil Lurks in California. Lee Marvin is Afraid." I called attention to the magazine and picked it up, and Jeff said, "Go ahead and read that. It's wild." So I opened the magazine, and the first article I saw was one with illustrations of necklaces in the form of devil signs and people participating in a witchcraft ceremony. The next page had an article about a girl called Lita and her black swan, which we discussed. I turned the page and saw an article on the Sharon Tate murders. We said it was terrible and that drug abusers were sick, disturbed people. I closed the magazine and placed it back on the table, and we continued watching TV. Altogether, the conversation about the entire series of articles lasted about 10 minutes out of a 2.5 or 3 hour visit, and most of that 10 minutes we discussed Lita and her black swan. What was the New York Times headline really saying? Friend says Captain discussed Tate killing. Was there a suggestion that the articles in Esquire might have been the trigger for MacDonald's homicidal rage? Was the reader being asked to wonder whether MacDonald had decided to create a Manson-like crime scene in order to deflect attention from himself? Harrison's statement, taken 5 months after the murders, was never publicized in the newspapers. I spoke with another friend of MacDonald's, Carol Butner. Her husband was a surgeon with the Special Forces at Fort Bragg. Carol Butner. They were the first people we met in Fort Bragg. Kimmy was the older one and Christy was the younger one, and Kimmy was very articulate. You could tell her mind was really quick. They loved their daddy. Man, he would come in and they'd go hang on him and grab his boots. They just adored him. I don't mean to say that I was over there all the time, but I would see the girls with him. And I remember I overheard a conversation Colette had at Thanksgiving on the phone. I was in the kitchen doing dishes with her or something, and she said, "Well, maybe you could tell by hearing my side of the conversation that I'm pregnant." And I hadn't known that until then. And I said, "Congratulations." And she had had some problems with pregnancies, and she said, "I've just got to watch some things." And then sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?